Yeah, right.
Think so? All right, let me go back. We'll try again. No. Well, anyway, we cleaned it off. And it's clean for a little while. But I bet if I go back in another 5 or 7 years, it won't look like that. Sorry. Where is it? Is it Charlton? South of
Charlton.
Charlton? Okay, wrong. That's the other side of the pond talking. Maybe 12, 13 miles from the center of London, almost directly south. Yeah. His mother grew up in Croydon nearby, and so he knew this area well. Okay, so sorry about the technical problems, but these things happen.
What, did you leave it there, next to the fence?
Well, that's where it was. It's embedded. It's embedded. It's down there, and they put the fence up. And Stephen sent me an article that talked that the town was doing quite a bit to, kind of get everything cleaned up. So I expected to see something really nice and lovely, which I didn't see 10 years ago, and it's still the same, all grown over. So.
Is there a well there?
No well anymore.
Nothing.
No, it's all dried up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's no well, there's nothing.
Could you not get it for the house here? Take it,
What?
could you not take it out of there and bring it up here? or is that what happened to your back, is it?
All right. We did the best we could on that one. Technical problems happen in life, and other problems happen in life, so it's not just technical problems. So I want to move on. Let's see if we can go back. And there we're back. Good. And now we come down here, right? So far, so good. Oxford. So we skipped Cambridge. Ruskin didn't really have a great deal to do with Cambridge, but he did get some wonderful things there. And of course, Clive lives there, so that's a reason to go to Cambridge. But this is how the main street and the high street in Oxford looked at the time of Ruskin's being there as a student. These are just some nice images. This is Christ Church, where he was for a long time, obviously doing some developing over there, but that's all changed now. Yeah, and if you'll remember, when he went up to Christ Church, when he went up to Oxford, the parents were very nervous that he would get in with people they didn't like. They didn't want him hanging around with just anybody, all these young men who probably drank too much and rode horses too much and did whatever they did. So his mother went up with him. So she lived in Oxford, and this is the inside of their rooms at up the 90 High Street, where they lived, where she lived all the time that he was at Oxford. He would go and have dinner with her very regularly. I don't know whether every night, but very regularly. And John James, the father, would come up on the weekends, and that's how it looks today. So that's it. One of the famous things that Ruskin is most famous for, he later went back as professor. He was appointed the first Slade Professor of Fine Art in 1870 at Oxford. His friend Henry Ackland and others were instrumental in getting him the appointment, because he was a pretty controversial guy, but he certainly was one of the great art critic of the age. So they got him appointed, and he started teaching the undergraduates, and some of his greatest lectures are written to these undergraduates, and some of them are just wonderful. And he always had this philosophy that people of means had lived too lazy a life. They should get out and work with their hands, and they should get out and do something that was good for other people. And so one of the projects that was very famous for at the time, was sort of notorious for at the time, was what's called the Hicksey Digging Project. And there's a little suburb about 4 or 5 miles from the center of Oxford, and mostly poor people lived there, thatched roof houses and things like that, and they had to go and do various kinds of menial jobs, and the road was so bad that they virtually couldn't get past it. They couldn't do anything. So Ruskin took it into his mind that they should go out, he and his students should go out and clean up the road. And the Hicksey Digging Project was very famous, and he got a group of students, and there's some wonderful stories about this. about how they would walk out during the day with the professor, and they would talk to Ruskin. They'd have him to himself, and they would hear all of these. And he was apparently very funny and very, very friendly with them, and so on. It was a wonderful time. And then they would get out there and they start digging. So we wanted to go see where this happened, because they were going to repair the road. They're going to fill in all the ruts and make it no longer a mud path, but make it a thoroughfare that people could go down. And that's what it looked like in those days. There's a little pub nearby called the Fishes. It's still there. It probably serves a slightly different fare than it did in those days, but very fine fare. A group of us found out when we were there. As you can see, they're all enjoying themselves at the pub before we go out to do our own digging. And there's a cottage nearby. John Ruskin, Slade Professor of Fine Art at the University of Oxford, mentioned this cottage and its beauty of its surroundings when, in 1874, he encouraged undergraduates to improve this road through the village and thus to feel the pleasure of useful, muscular work. And among the muscular were Oscar Wilde, Arnold Toynbee, and later Canon Hardwick Rawnsley, who was very instrumental again in the history of Ruskin in this part of the world. Here's some of the matched huts. Yeah, it's not quite like it looked in the old days. That's a lovely hut, don't you think? It's not hardly a hut. Yeah. And there I am digging. This is about where it was. That's the, you can't see what's going on. Okay. Up there is sort of where the mound was of the stuff that they dug and they put it in and so on. I don't know how significant it was, whether it was a great success or not. And we were just about to leave, the group of us who were there, when this fellow this older guy on the bike with a bike helmet on came out, a really old guy, and I wasn't there, but a number of the lovely people who were with us started talking to him about the history of the place, and his wife had just died. He was in his 90s, and he was telling us about living in the area, and that his wife had, this is for Stephen's ears, that his wife had many photographs of the historical past of that area, so there may be treasure troves there. We don't. But anyway, he was very friendly, he was very nice. And we had a good time talking to him. And now I just want to give you a little bit about the Sheldonian Theater where Ruskin lectured. We got to the Sheldonian a little late on the day that we were touring Oxford, but it looked like this once. I don't know what it looked like this time because it wouldn't let us in. We were 5 minutes late. So Ruskin used to lecture there, and his lectures were so popular that he often had to give them twice, and in this large audience, in this place that could handle a large audience. So, in any event, here's Rawnsley's description of Ruskin as lecturer. He says the lecture hall was always crowded. In he would come, and here and there would shake hands and thank some young scapegrace for honoring him with his presence. And then giving his black silk gown a hitch on his left shoulder and putting his hand behind his back and gathering his gown up with it, he would launch straight away into a kind of personal explanation of why he had changed his subject at the last moment and why he hoped for forgiveness. These prefatory remarks were generally brimful of joyous humor, sometimes of sarcasm, very trenchant too, but relieved of bitterness by the evident sense of fun and good temper beneath it all. The undergraduates would cheer, point here and there, and one could see how the master's spirit rose within him at the encouragement. And then suddenly his manner would change. And putting his hands in front of him almost in the attitude of one praying and leaning forward over the desk, he would by the gentle uplifting and raising of his clasped hand add much emphasis to his words. Very deliberately he would then begin to speak. His voice would rather chant or sing than say and say what his heart felt, and with such a rhythmic utterance as it was not been my lot to ever hear since. He would drive home his prophet's message and leave us all ashamed of our selfishness or ignorance. I have heard his voice spoken of as harsh. It is a libel. His voice was tender and full of tears, and that curious roll of the R, in which such words as entirely or uttermost or dear was specially noticeable, seemed always to lend the charm of individuality to his speech, while it betrayed his northern origin. One other thing that astonished the undergraduates was Ruskin's power of taking unlimited pains in their behalf. The lectures were not only the most careful in the language, but the most profusely illustrated by objects of art, by precious pictures and photographs, brought together at risk and at cost to the hour's lecture. So one of the things he would do is that he would come in with a turn of watercolor. and he would use, or sometimes 2 or 3, and he would use it to illustrate what he was trying to get across to them about the meaning of art. So you'll be happy to know I brought one today. There it is up on the wall. And this, he actually did this, right? So he would be talking about the glories of this turn. This is called Sunrise at the Tamar. And it's a beautiful Ruskin Turner watercolor, and the sun rising, and all of this beautiful bucolic and so on and so forth. And he said, that's what Turner saw. And that's what Turner loved. It's just this most glorious thing. But he says, you wouldn't want that today, would you? No. Today, you'd see the river and you'd think you could use it. So what you do is you'd build a factory. Right? And the factory would be here. Yes? It would be here, and you'd have to have chimneys, and the smoke would go up, and all of that, and you'd be manufacturing whatever it was, and you'd have to have some hovels for the workers, and they would live there, and you'd have places like that, and then of course the workers and the factory would make a mess of itself, and so you'd have to have outpourings of refuse into the river that would go down like this into the river and so on like that. And he said, now you have to get goods to and from the factory, so in order to do that you're going to have a bridge, and the bridge will go here, yeah, like this, and on it will run a train, of course. It looks something like this, and, and it'll smoke like that. Yeah, and then over here, because it's very prosperous, you'll probably have a sub-factory over here. Yes, and that'll start like this, and it too will smoke and so on. And that's what you want. And he actually did this on a piece of glass. Over the turquoise. That was very... And then he ended it by saying, I rather like the original, don't you? Isn't that lovely? I would have loved to have been at that one. Anyway, true story. We have 2 different accounts of that particular lecture. I don't know whether he did it more than once. And of course, his fury at modernity was virtually unbridled. And the growth of, I don't know, just the spoliation of the world. He could barely deal with it. And so he wrote in 1884, he gave a lecture called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, by which he begins by saying, I mean nothing metaphoric by this. I'm going to tell you exactly what's going on. And then he takes the whole lecture to talk about the pollution and the spoiling of the modern world, and how horrific it is, and how we have absolutely no sensibility of what we're doing to ourselves, and so on. And he ends with this very famous bit, which I'd like to share with you, because that will get us into what I would like to do next. He said, I should have liked to have blotted down for you a bit of plague cloud to put beside this that we've been talking about. But heaven knows you can see enough of it nowadays without any trouble of mine. And if you want in a hurry to see what the sun looks like through it, you've only to throw a bad half crown into a basin of soap and water. That will show you today's sun. Blanched sun, blighted grass, blinded man. If in conclusion you ask me for any conceivable cause or meaning of these things, I can tell you none, according to your modern beliefs. But I can tell you what meaning it would have borne to the men of old time. Remember, for the last 20 years, England and all the foreign nations, either tempting her or following her, have blasphemed the name of God deliberately and openly, and have done iniquity by proclamation, every man doing as much injustice to his brother as it is in his power to do. And of states in such moral gloom, every seer of old predicted physical gloom, saying, the light shall be darkened in the heavens thereof, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. And then he goes on to talk more about the coming perishing of the world as we know it. He ends by saying, we have wars and we have prophecies, as declared by your own elect journals almost every day, that the empire of England these days, on which formerly the sun never set, has become one on which now he never rises. Really. So by this time, this is now the 1870s, Ruskin is convinced that he's failed in almost everything he's ever tried to do. He's written this wonderful art criticism, this architecture criticism. He hoped to transform the world. People would see the truth of what he was saying. There's a lovely passage which I came across, but I don't remember what I did with a note right now, where he said, you know what I'm really good at? I'm not good at painting, and I'm not good at poeting, and I'm not good at all these other things, but I am good at taking something and reasoning it through to its real conclusion, to see exactly what's going on. And that's what I've been telling you all these years, what's really happening with these things. And you don't listen to it. You don't hear what I have to say. He thought he was being crystal clear. So he drove the price of Turner paintings way up, but people didn't really get the real message, which was what Turner was trying to show us was the great magnificence of the world, and that we should appreciate that and then go out and enjoy that world in a wonderful way. He failed at his political economy, which we haven't dealt with very much, but we're sort of on the edge of here. He failed at his political economy. He gave wrote this wonderful short book, onto this last, where he essentially analyzes the central faults of the assumptions of laissez-faire capitalism and suggested instead of what we might call a humane capitalism. Nobody listened. They derided him and said he was an art critic. What was he doing messing with political economy theory and so on. All through the 1860s, he wrote political economy tracts of one sort or another, about work, about many, many different kinds of things, and felt he had been ignored by them all. So he really came into the 1870s thinking he had failed at everything. He didn't know what to do. The elites weren't listening to him. The political economists weren't listening to him. Nobody was listening. What could he do? And so he began this series of letters to working people that he called Fors Clavigera, and he said, okay, what I will do is that I'll establish a guild. I'll have an organization which will then be dedicated to the service of the people of England by those who wish to save her from this modern scourge, this storm cloud of the century. So here's a passage in one of the anthologies of Ruskin that I came across, where he talks about, and he said he will call it the St. George's Guild, after St. George, who is, of course, the patron saint of this country. And he writes this. He said, when I first read the legend of St. George, my eyes grew wet with tears of true delight. First in the knowledge of so many beautiful things at once given to me by the story, and then in the surety of the wide good that the work thus begun would spring up into, in ways before wholly unconceived by me. It was like coming to the brow of some healthy moorland, where here and there one had watched or helped the reaper of some patch of thinly scattered corn, and seeing suddenly a great plain white to the harvest, far as the horizon. So he establishes the St. George's Museum, and the collection, or part of the collection, is still at the Ruskin Gallery in Sheffield, because that's Louise Pullen that we visited the other day, and it was dedicated to educating working people. This is the view of Sheffield, an industrial city in the heart of industrial England, which had tremendous